Hi, Divya. Yeah, I can hear you.
Excellent. How's it going? How are you doing?
Doing good, doing good. How are you doing?
Great, great. I'm excited to hear about the EQ framework. Suman, that's what we're going to be talking about today, right? As a continuation from last week.
That's right.
Excellent. Hey, Uday.
Hi Suman.
Hey,
Hi
Uday.
Divya. Great to see you on the second episode.
Yes, I'm also very excited.
Okay, let's get started. Suman, do you want to take it?
Sure, sure. So happy to be back. In the first one, we talked about why self-mastery a prerequisite for empathy and relationships. And in that, we started by asking a very basic question, which is the why question, right? Is it really important to build empathy and relationships? So that's what we kind of started with. Then we got on to the self mastery part, and today's going to be a continuation. And we said we will look at it from the EQ framework. Now, the EQ framework, as many of you already know, is pretty simple, logical. So essentially, it starts with self awareness. Based on that, you have self regulation, which is really about the self part or the self confidence, the personal competence, if you will. Once you have that, then you start building empathy, and finally, it's about building relationships. Now, I love this model because essentially each one builds on the other. It's very easy to understand. The first two is about the self, and the next two is about building relationships. Now, why is it that they are so interdependent? So let's look at it from two, three angles. The first one is we cannot build empathy if you're not aware of ourselves. Okay, which is really linking the self-awareness with the empathy part. Now, and I'm going to dive into a little bit more into each of these, but let me just state the broader headings initially. So one is that. The second is we cannot build relationships if you're not able to manage ourselves, right? And this is also very, very critical uh, from our, the way we manage ourselves, the way we lead. So this is really tying the self regulation with the relationship. And the third is we cannot regulate ourselves if we are not aware of ourselves. And I think this is probably the most interesting one, which is that you can only regulate yourself in when you're aware of yourself, right? It sounds very simple. It sounds like it's commonsensical, but often the biggest gap is in that. So essentially, what it's showing is that all of these things, these four aspects that I talked of EQ, are kind of interconnected. So let's start diving into the first one, which is we cannot build empathy if you're not aware, right, of ourselves. Now, very quickly on the empathy part. Empathy is really about putting ourselves in the other person's shoes. It's about feeling what the other person is feeling, thinking what the other person is thinking. So there is a thinking part and there's a feeling part. So the thinking part is also called cognitive empathy, right, which is about perspective taking. Um, and that perspective taking really requires a foundation of trust, right? Requires a foundation of respect, humility, and that really comes from self-assessment, right? When we are aware of our own strengths, when we are aware of our limits, priorities, because by doing that, that gives us confidence, that gives us respect, that gives us humility, kind of. And we've often seen this, right? For leaders, if they think they know it all, who don't show humility, it's very difficult for them to kind of understand the other person's perspective because it starts with the inability to be aware of their own. They're not very good at doing a self-assessment, right? So that's on the cognitive side, and on the affective side, which is really about emotions, it's very simple. It's like if we have to be aware of somebody else's emotions, we have to be aware of our own emotions, isn't it? Um, Now, are we really aware of our own emotions? Is the question. Most of the time, we are not. Now, this is a question I ask when we do our sessions. Hey, very simple question. Just go around the room and say, "Hey, how do you feel?" And the kind of responses we get is very interesting. People would say, "I can use this in my day-to-day work," or they would say, "My boss needs this training." Yeah, that's a very common one. Um, So those are all cognitive aspects, right? It's not the effective part. Sometimes people will start by using the word I feel. They will say, I feel this is very relevant for us. But essentially, you're saying you're using the word feel, it's still a cognition. So the point is, and I think this has happened because of our conditioning, because of our, and we've never been taught to express our feelings. Uh, the thinking part is always at the top, right? Now, what I'm looking for is like, hey, you know what? I'm feeling excited. I'm feeling confident. I'm feeling concerned. I'm feeling confused. I'm feeling anxious, disappointed. Whatever, the human emotions are so wide and so nuanced. So those are the kind of things one is looking for, right? The point is, if we are not aware of our own emotions, how do we? There's no way we can be aware of somebody else's emotions, isn't it? And that is the real link between empathy and awareness. Okay, so let me take a pause here. I talked of three parts, so this is the first part. So let me just take a pause and say, is this making sense?
Yep, Suman, absolutely. So far, so good. My one thing was there is self awareness and self management, which you talked about, and that has to
Yes.
do with the self. But a lot of self awareness and management is I mean, again, it needs to do with how you view or perceive or look at yourself in a social context, right? So there is a
Yes.
big social component to the self itself, and it's not something you can divorce one from the other, right? So I'd be
Correct.
curious to kind of see how that gets weaved in. You did talk about it with emotion and empathy, about only if you understand emotions in others, and it's called theory of mind, right? When you can understand why a person is behaving some sort of way, only
Correct.
when your systems are in place, right? But yeah, it would be fascinating to see how we weave in self regulation with the social aspect of it also.
Definitely, definitely. And we've seen this in people, isn't it? We've had bosses. Sometimes we walk into their cabin and they look at us and say, "I know exactly what you're thinking," right? Haven't we had bosses like this? They're the people who have high cognitive empathy, right? So we see this in motion. Okay, great. So moving on to the second one, which is we cannot build relationships if we are not able to manage ourselves. Okay, and there's a lot of science behind it, right? For instance, if we display aggression, the emotional connects do not form. What we often end up doing is invoking a fight or flight. And quite often, are we even aware of how, that we are displaying aggression? Or I might feel I'm not displaying aggression, that's how I am, but the other side might be perceiving it as aggression, right? So is it aggressive? Is it passive? Is it passive aggressive? The point is, and Divya, to your earlier point, the awareness is, there are two parts, right? So one is about, am I aware of myself, but the other thing is also about what is the gap between the way I see myself and how others see us or see me, right? And there is often a big gap there. So I might think I'm not being aggressive, but actually I might be, right? I might think I'm a good listener, but others might not see it that way. Okay, so that's the first part. So if we are displaying aggression or displaying passive aggression, then emotional connects do not form, right? Or let's say when we are self-centered. Okay, so for instance, a boss who takes all the credit, right? uh, Very difficult to form a bond, very difficult to form a relationship with that person, isn't it? So essentially it's about trust, and I think the foundation of all of this is trust happens when we are vulnerable. Yeah, uh, people will be able to trust me when I do what I say I will do, okay, and do it well. So there is a reliability aspect and there's a credibility aspect, right? And also about what they call intimacy, which is also about how comfortable the other person is, right? So if you and I are working, I may be credible, reliable, but if you're not comfortable working with me, that can also come in the way of building a trust, right? Do people feel safe? And that is why psychological safety becomes very important. Okay. Um, Now here again, these are to me is very interesting because when I tell people, "Hey, do you end up doing what you say you will do?" And most of the times, people say, even without thinking, "So of course I do everything that what I say I will do." But in reality, it's not like that, right? Are we really reliable, right? So there's a nice quote which says, "We judge ourselves by our intent, and others by their actions. And I use a simple example, right? So let's say somebody calls and you're busy and you say, you know what, let me just call you back. How often do you call back that person, right? And I think what is happening here is basically we are judging ourselves by our intent because we are very busy, and this is why our intent was there to call, but we didn't call because we were busy. Whereas if the other person does it, we were basing it on their actions, right? So Divya, I remember you had mentioned about the fundamental attribution bias in the first one, right? That is also very relevant here, isn't it? So, for instance, and for people who are hearing, I mean, for whom this concept is new, it's one of the biases which is very fascinating, which is that we judge others by more of their character or personality, whereas we judge others by our circumstances. So, for instance, let's say we're having a meeting and somebody comes in late. Now, what happens is the initial tendency is to think of, try to label the person. Oh, you know what? The person is not serious. The person is lazy. Let's say next day I come late, and you know why I came late? Oh, because there was a lot of traffic. Okay, so it was not really in my hands. I got stuck in traffic. But it doesn't occur to me that maybe that other person also got stuck in traffic, right? Whereas I have kind of labeled that person and drawn and kind of I'm judging the person, right? And based on their personality or character, which can be quite dangerous. Okay, so that's the fundamental attribution bias, right? So now, how is that relevant here? Because we end up labeling people. Anybody who's approaching us, before they approach us, we're forming an image in our mind, right? Oh, this person is lazy, this person is kamchor, or whatever it is, right? And the moment we do that, that kind of takes away from building deeper relationships. And as I keep saying, my favorite thing is, it's the knowing doing gap. It's not about the knowing, how do you do it? How are we able to suspend judgment, not label people? Or even if I'm labeling people, am I conscious of the fact that I'm labeling people? Because only when I become aware of it, can I start making a change? Okay. So I'll stop there. So that is essentially to tie the relationships with the need to manage ourselves. Okay. So let me take a pause here.
Jafar, Uday, you want to come in? Jafar, I saw you on.
I have too many questions. So Uday, if you want to go first.
Okay.
No, go with them. Go for it.
No, I've been a spree of questioning a lot of foundations, right? So it's a result of that. So Suman, I'm like, why do we call it emotional quotient or emotional EQ framework, right? I'm just asking as an experiment, as a thought exercise, right? Why don't we call it logical framework? I mean, just going back saying that if I understand when you said if we understand ourselves better, then we are able to understand others and their situations better, right? And how do I understand myself? By observation, right? By connecting the dots, by recognizing patterns in how I behave in different environments when I'm exposed to different triggers, which means my mind is working, the logical part of the a deliberate part of the brain is working to make those connections and identify those patterns in myself, and hence I am able to have that perspective of others that it is possible that they could be in this situation, hence they're acting out like this, right? So it's a result of logic, right? I mean, and then I know that anything that you trigger, there's emotion in the body first, and then we perceive it, right? So what comes first then, right? Emotion comes first and then comes logic, or the emotions and the how the neuroscience, not neuroscience, but how it's all wired inside our heads, and body itself has logic, right? Which we are trying to make sense of, and hence as the outcome, we call it emotional quotient because it's coming from the body, right? So I'm asking because we say that when people are logical, they don't necessarily are emotional, right? They're not using their emotional quotient. That's what the sort of popular assumption or view is. So just questioning.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think there are quite a few questions there. So let me see if I can kind of answer very quickly. So there are two things I heard. When people are emotional, you're either emotional or logical. So that's again, a lot of research has happened there, and most often we tend to feel that we are more rational, right? Because rational has always got it's always at the higher end, right, of the pecking order. We take pride in saying we're very rational, but research is showing that human beings actually were driven much more by emotions. And whether which comes first is one of those chicken and egg kind of stories. I think they coexist, right? You can never separate one from the other, right? Um, so when we see something, what happens is the brain has to first make meaning, right? It's sense making. So let's say I'm going in a car, and then suddenly I find that there is a traffic jam, or I find that they have dug up the road and they did not inform anybody, and there's kind of, because of which I'm going to now get late for a meeting in office. So what's happening is how I react is a function of what kind of sense I'm making of that, right? Um, and I can view it in different ways, isn't it? Um, and depending on how I view it, my emotions also will be similar. Okay, so I think a lot of it, and we can train our mind to actually view things in different ways, yeah, which is basically the core of the neuroplasticity thing. So yeah, both of them do exist. I personally feel that you can kind of, depending on what sense you're making, your emotions will vary. I hope I'm able to address part of the question at least.
Yeah, Suman,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, these are exploratory questions.
Yeah, exactly. So let me start. I end with say the last part, because we just have 3 minutes to go. The last part is basically about we cannot regulate ourselves if we're not aware of ourselves, isn't it? See, typically what happens is leadership is always outward focused. Yeah, as a leader, we need to know how to inspire others, direct others, change others, influence others, what have you, right? Turn others around at times of adversity. That's what we're looking for in leaders, isn't it? But what happens if we turn that lens inward? Do we know how to inspire ourselves? Do we know how to direct ourselves, change ourselves, influence ourselves, or train or turn our own self around at times of adversity? What kind of resilience do we have? So, and I think that's a paradigm shift. It's essentially about mastering the what you could call the inner game of leadership, right? Before we master the outer game, and which is why this framework I said I really like, because it starts with the self, right? And in the first one I mentioned that seems counterintuitive. We always try to address everything from the outer perspective, but you really have to go inside to change yourself uh, before we change others. And there's a lot of lack of self awareness. After, to your point, the other thing I wanted to mention is it's a lot of thinking, it's a lot of being rational, but also, are you aware of what you're thinking, right? That is about self awareness, right? So, what I think they call it metacognition. Are you aware of what you're thinking? And there are a lot of examples of lack of awareness. We see it all around us, isn't it? And the simplest one is, I think, speaking too much. And I've seen this with so many people. Now tell me, the guy who's been speaking and the fellow has been working for maybe 10, 15 years, are you saying that he or she is not aware that they speak too much? And I find that question fascinating. And often, they are not aware, right? Um, so in fact, somebody mentioned that out of the coaching, out of when they learned something from coaching, they said this was like my BO of relationships, right? Just like when you have BO, you're not aware, but everybody else around you are aware. It is almost like this. How can something so fundamental, uh, you know, not be aware to yourself? But unfortunately, that's how it is, right? So speaking too much, or maybe not listening, right? The person is tuning off. Are you aware that you often interrupt people? Yeah. Are you aware that you keep saying, or maybe some filler like that, a couple of times in every sentence? There are so many people who keep doing this, isn't it? With every sentence they're saying, and after 5 minutes, the other person is kind of counting. They just stop listening. They're just counting how many times this person has said, Okay. These kind of things happen, isn't it? So what happens?